What does it take to build an empire that lasts 1,000 years? It takes roads, legions, and laws. But for ancient Rome, it took something else. It took millions of unseen hands, shackled in bondage, whose forced labor was the brutal, indispensable engine of the entire civilization. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're uncovering the dark foundation of the Roman world, its massive and terrifying slave economy. Rome wasn't always a society defined by slavery. In its early days as a modest city-state, the average Roman was a citizen farmer, working his own small plot of land. Slavery existed, but it was on a small scale. A household might have one or two enslaved people who worked alongside the family. A major source of servitude was even a form of debt bondage called nexum, where a Roman citizen could pledge himself as labor to pay off a debt. But in the 3rd century BCE, everything changed. Rome's ambition exploded, and its legions marched out to conquer the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars against Carthage, followed by conquests in Greece, Spain, and the East, didn't just win territory. They produced the single most valuable commodity for the growing republic: human beings. Roman military doctrine was ruthless. When a city was conquered, its entire population could be rounded up and sold. After capturing the city of Tarentum in 209 BCE, the Romans sold 30,000 of its citizens into slavery. After the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, one Roman general enslaved 150,000 people from the region of Epirus in a single campaign. The final destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE saw its last 50,000 survivors sold into bondage. This constant, massive influx of cheap human labor transformed Rome forever. The wealthy elite, enriched by war, bought up huge tracts of land, creating enormous agricultural estates known as latifundia. These weren't family farms. They were industrial-scale plantations dedicated to cash crops like wine and olive oil, and they were worked by vast gangs of enslaved people. The traditional Roman farmer, the citizen soldier, couldn't compete. Many lost their land and flocked to the city of Rome, creating a huge, unemployed urban population. A vicious cycle was born. More conquest meant more slaves. More slaves fueled the latifundia, which created more wealth for the elite. And the enriched elite and the landless poor both pushed for even more military expansion, promising more glory and more spoils. By the 1st century BCE, Italy's population may have been as much as 40% enslaved. Rome had become a true slave society, and a highly organized machine had developed to feed its insatiable hunger. War was the primary engine, but a constant supply also came from piracy. For decades, the Cilician pirates were a major power in the Mediterranean, raiding coastal towns and kidnapping travelers to sell. Their main hub was the island of Delos, a tax-free port that became the largest slave market in the world. The geographer Strabo claimed that on a single day, Delos could receive and sell 10,000 slaves. Once acquired, these human beings were funneled into a sophisticated trade network. In Rome, they were sold in the Forum, displayed naked on a platform called a catasta, so buyers could inspect their physical condition. A placard, or titulus, was hung around each person's neck, listing their origin, age, skills, and any known defects, like being prone to running away or suffering from epilepsy. As the empire's borders stabilized and mass conquest slowed, the focus shifted to another source: breeding. Enslaved people born within a household were called verni. Legally, the child of an enslaved woman belonged to her master, regardless of who the father was. For many owners, encouraging their slave to have children was a long-term investment, a way to create a self-sustaining workforce. To speak of a single life of a slave in Rome is impossible. It was a vast spectrum of human experience, determined by work, location, and the whims of an owner. At the absolute bottom of this spectrum was life in the mines. Condemnation to the mines, or damnatio in metallum, was a death sentence. The historian Diodorus Siculus left a horrifying account of the Spanish silver mines, describing people working day and night in dark, unventilated tunnels. He wrote that they were compelled by the blows of the overseers to endure the severity of their plight, and that death in their eyes is more to be desired than life. Life on the great agricultural estates, the latifundia, was scarcely better. Here, field hands worked in gangs from before sunrise to after sunset. At night, they were often locked away in semi-subterranean prisons called ergastula. The agricultural writer Cato the Elder gave chillingly practical advice, telling owners to sell off old or sick slaves because they were no longer a profitable tool. And that's what they were in the eyes of the law. A slave was not a persona, a person. They were a res, a thing. A piece of property, like land or livestock. A master held the power of life and death over them. A chilling law, the Senatus Consultum Solanianum, stated that if a master was murdered in his home, all slaves living under his roof were to be tortured and executed, on the assumption they were either complicit or had failed to protect him. In the year 61 CE, when a city official named Lucius Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his slaves, the state enforced this law. All 400 slaves of his household, men, women, and children, were put to death. This was the brutal reality that underpinned the entire system. Life in the cities offered a wider range of fates. A wealthy household might employ dozens of specialized slaves, cooks, hairdressers, secretaries, and tutors. A trusted, educated slave like a secretary might live in relative comfort and have a good chance of eventually being granted freedom, a process called manumission. But this proximity to the master was also a danger. Domestic slaves were subject to the owner's moods and violent tempers, and sexual abuse was rampant and considered a master's right. The story of Vedius Pollio, a wealthy friend of the Emperor Augustus, tells of his habit of throwing slaves who displeased him into a pond of giant moray eels to be eaten alive. At the darkest end of the urban spectrum were the gladiators. These were typically war captives, criminals, or disobedient slaves sold to a gladiatorial school or ludus. Their life was a bizarre paradox. They were prisoners living under a brutal training regime, but they received excellent medical care because they were a valuable investment. A successful gladiator could become a superstar, adored by the crowds. But for every champion, hundreds died anonymously in the sand of the arena. It was from this world, a world designed to perfect the art of killing, that the greatest slave revolt in history would erupt. The Roman elite lived with a constant, simmering fear of the millions they held in bondage. The philosopher Seneca wrote, "As many slaves as we have, so many enemies we have." Resistance was constant. For most, it took the form of quiet, everyday defiance, sabotaging tools, working slowly, feigning illness, or stealing food. A more desperate act was running away. A fugitive, or fugitivens if caught, would be severely punished, often branded on the forehead with the letters FUG. Some were forced to wear metal collars with inscriptions, like one found in Rome that reads, "I have fled. Catch me. When you have returned me to my master, Zoninus, you will receive a gold coin." But sometimes, this simmering resistance exploded into open, armed insurrection. The first two major servile wars erupted in Sicily, where the brutal conditions on the latifundia created a powder keg. But these were confined to an island. In 73 BCE, the fire would ignite on the Italian mainland and threaten Rome itself. It began in a gladiator school in the city of Capua. A group of about 78 gladiators armed with kitchen knives and cleavers fought their way to freedom. Their leader was a Thracian named Spartacus. Plutarch describes him as a man of incredible strength, intelligence, and culture, superior to his fate. He was joined by two Gallic leaders, Crassus and Inananus. The small band escaped to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, and their numbers began to swell as rural slaves flocked to join them. Rome, viewing this as a minor problem, sent a militia of 3,000 men under the commander Claudius Glaber. Glaber blocked the only known path down the volcano, intending to starve the rebels out. But Spartacus demonstrated his military genius. His men wove ladders from wild vines, rappelled down a sheer cliff face under the cover of darkness, and attacked the Roman camp from the rear, completely destroying them. After defeating a second Roman force, the rebel army's numbers exploded to over 70,000. This was no longer a breakout, it was a war. In 72 BCE, the Roman Senate, now thoroughly alarmed, sent both of the year's consuls with full legions. But the rebel army had fractured. Crassus, with 30,000 followers, split from Spartacus and was soon defeated and killed. Spartacus, however, marched north and, in an incredible campaign, defeated both consular armies one after the other. The path to the Alps was now open. He could have led his people out of Italy to freedom. And then, for reasons historians still debate, he turned back south. This decision would be fatal. In a panic, Rome turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the city. Crassus raised a new army of over 40,000 men and pursued Spartacus. After his own subordinate was defeated in a skirmish, Crassus revived the brutal punishment of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 men of the cohort that had fled. Discipline was restored. Spartacus was eventually cornered in the toe of Italy. Crassus built a wall and a ditch nearly 37 miles long, trapping the rebel army. After a daring breakout through Crassus's lines, Spartacus knew his position was hopeless. Other Roman armies were returning to Italy. He turned to fight Crassus one last time. The final battle took place in 71 BCE. Spartacus is said to have fought heroically, trying to cut his way to Crassus himself before being surrounded and killed. His body was never identified. The rebel army was annihilated. Crassus took 6,000 survivors prisoner. In a final, horrific act of retribution, he had all 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. For over 120 miles, the road was lined with crosses, a gruesome monument to a failed revolution, and a terrifying warning to every slave in Italy. The Spartacus rebellion was the last of the great slave wars. The system of slavery, though shaken, had held. It was the indispensable foundation of the Roman world, an engine of prosperity built on the suffering of millions. But the story of Spartacus and the countless acts of resistance show that even in the face of absolute power, the human spirit can never be completely extinguished. It's a brutal reminder that the glories of empire often have a dark and terrible human cost. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.